Morning.
Matt, how are you?
I'm good, Jason. How are you?
Pretty good.
Thanks for joining us today. We
Yeah,
appreciate it.
you're welcome.
Let me just confirm, how do you pronounce your last name?
Cervenec.
Cervenec.
Yep. It's a derivation of Slovak for July.
For what?
The month of July in Slovak
Oh,
after it's
okay.
been heavily anglicized.
Cervenec.
Yep.
Okay. So I guess I'll just kind of kick things off at first. And then as I think about it, I'll make you co-host
Okay.
so that you can share and do what? Okay, let's see here.
Let me see. Screen share actually might work right now. Let me test something real fast.
Okay, I see make host. I don't see make co-host. Where that?
Well, screen share is working, so.
Oh, that's great. I guess everybody's a co-host.
The only thing we may have challenges with is if we want to do breakout rooms, I'll have to have you control that on your end if you can.
Yeah, I think we're going to probably nix that.
Okay.
If you, yeah, just keep it simple if we can, and between Jay, I'm the 6th grade catechist, and Jay, we're going to be joined by Jay Carini. He's the 7th grade catechist. The 8th grade catechist couldn't make it, and as you know, I think Krista's not able to make it this morning either. So in terms of breaking out the kids into their grades, that might be a little bit logistically challenged.
Okay.
So we'll just keep it kind of simple.
Okay. Let me do a little edit here to something that real fast.
So do you want to entertain questions along the way, or do you want to try to hold many to the end, or?
We'll probably do them throughout. It's actually broken down into about 4 different sections.
Oh.
It would be good if people had a paper to write at 2 different points in it. There's a little video clip we have, and then an activity, but I'm going to adapt that real fast.
Okay. Now we have about an hour. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hey, Jay. Morning, Jay.
Good morning, guys.
Hey, you're being kind of cut off there. I can only see your Cavaliers. There you go. Are you UVA?
I am. Yep.
Oh, okay. My wife is Virginia Tech. She's a Hokie. So yes, indeed.
Yeah, I'm from Virginia originally. So.
And Jason, you're a Buckeye, right?
I am.
My
Grew
wife
up in Toledo, all my degrees at Ohio State.
There you go. My wife works there now. At the university.
Which department?
That's a tough question.
It's kind of convoluted. Sometimes a few of us sit in about 4 or 5 different places.
Yeah, she's definitely on the administrative side, on the kind of the marketing, alumni development.
Oh, okay.
I can get her, but anyway, we'll give folks certainly a few minutes here to join. We expect to have 50, 60, 70 on the Zoom. And Jay and I we'll try to keep track in terms of attendance, and certainly if anything comes up, we'll try to monitor the chats and anything else that may come along the way here.
Yeah, that's always the most helpful thing is the chats. Just because you can't see every screen that's open at the same time, so that would be helpful.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of programs and running my whole team virtual for a year now, so we're pretty well versed in every technology you could use.
Yeah. Do you typically use Zoom or Google Meet or whatever?
We started using Zoom about 6 years ago. So
is that right? Wow.
Oh yeah, we were a real early adopter for a long series of reasons, and it was a great accident. So when it happened, we already were kind of pros at it.
That's great.
That was a complete accident.
I'll admit that I'm still not a Zoom expert, but we stumble and fumble our way through.
Well, hopefully we have some light at the end of the tunnel. So we'll be able to
Indeed, yes,
go
yes.
back to in-person here shortly.
Yeah, I worked many years at J&J, and this weekend they just got their vaccine approved.
Yeah.
So that's good news.
Yeah, we have three in the pipeline now.
And it looks like the little record button is on, so hopefully that means the recording worked.
Yes, we'll definitely mention that up front. Yeah, thanks for noticing. That's one thing we could check off the list, I hope. Now, finding the recording afterwards is just a whole nother day. And then converting that so that we can YouTube it.
Yeah, when we have programs, that's always the hardest thing, is to remember to hit the button. So many other things going on.
She said she's going to send out questions later in the week, so you kind of got to pay attention.
I put a prayer at the beginning. Do you have a person you want to volunteer to do that, or do you usually call on somebody to do that, or have a random die to roll, or?
Well, we can.
I know
can
what your
ask-
norms are.
Yeah, I can ask my 6th grade class to kick us off. Are you going to share it on the screen?
Yep, I'll put it up on the screen.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. So I'll have my 6th grade volunteers to kind of just kick us off in unison, and then we can all join in. Thank you for doing that.
Make sure it actually works.
Boy, lots going on there.
This is one of my
Ooh,
favorite cartoons from earlier this year.
Cartoons and all. We'll just give another few moments here. I see it's 9:30, so we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, we should get, Jason, do you want to throw the screen back, I guess, to?
Yeah.
Then
You
we could,
have something you want to share, or do you want me to?
well,
Do you want me to
let's,
shut down the screen share for a sec?
yeah, just so we can kick
Got it.
things off, yeah. And then we can come back to that. That'd
Yep.
be great. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Zoom this morning on this kind of dreary, rainy Sunday in Lent. This is a big Zoom today. We have all of 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade today. I see we're up to 50 attendees. That's great. So again, thanks all for joining. My name is Matt Zuchek. I am the 6th grade catechist. So, hi, 6th graders. I'm joined by Mr. Jay Carini, who is our 7th grade catechist.
Good morning. Thanks, Matt.
And we have a special guest speaker today, and we'll get to that in a moment. Just a couple of housekeeping things. You may notice that the red light is blinking, so we are recording this session. So please make note of that. As you join, and I see most of you have, go ahead and turn your video on. That's a special request by Mrs. Krista Joseph. So make sure your video is on through the duration of this presentation. And if you have questions, we can invite questions along the way, or you can hold them to the end. And Mr. Crean and I will be checking the chat for questions as well. So you can send them along there as well if you want. Now today's topic is, I mentioned the dreary rainy day today, is about weather and about the climate. And about that, Pope Francis recently stated, I think it was back in December around Christmas, that there was an alliance that's needed between mankind and our environment and Mother Earth. Pope Francis went on to say that the time has come for a need for us to change our direction as it relates to the environment and to climate. Now today, we are pleased to have as our guest, let's see if I get his last name, Mr. Jason Cervenec from The Ohio State University, where he is the education director of the Polar and Climate Research Center. So Jason, you want to take it over?
Okay, thanks. I also work with the creation care team for the diocese. So you're going to see some things I'll pull in from that in addition to the kind of the background I have working in the scientific community. So let me take a second here to put up a screen share. And Matt, you said you had maybe a volunteer that wanted to do the prayer to start. So this is actually grabbed from the Pope Francis's most recent encyclical. A lot of what I'll talk about today will focus on an encyclical that was believed to focus largely on the environment, but actually is a bigger one than that. It came out 5 years ago. And this is one that came out just a few months ago that I think is really a second part to that writing letter by the Pope.
Great. So so 6th graders, let's all in unison kind of kick us off together. So go ahead and unmute yourself if you can. We'll start it off, and then everybody else kind of join in after the first sentence or two. Sound good? Okay, 1 and a 2 and a 3. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, Father
of
our human family, you created all human beings equal
in
dignity. Pour forth into our hearts eternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world. A world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the people and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody. So I'll break this morning down into 4 different parts. We'll do a quick introduction. If you do have something to write with, that would be helpful because there's 2 times we're going to pause to have people write just for a second. Part of that, then I'll go into an activity that'll take a little bit shorter because we're not going to use breakout rooms today for that. There's some information I'll share. And then the part I like is kind of the closing of what you could go out and do today. So if you do have questions, drop those into the chat throughout. It's a little more engaging if we do it that way, as opposed to just hold everything to the end. This will actually probably go pretty fast this morning. So a little about background about myself. I love being outdoors. That's probably why all the people I work with work what they do. We get a chance sometimes to go to some pretty remote regions of the world, but I like to be outdoors a lot. I like taking my family outdoors. This is my second career. I actually spent a little over a decade as a high school teacher, and as part of that, taught in India for a year, which is a very transformative experience for me because a lot of what I look at now and I study now, I saw people living with that. I lived in the city of Mumbai, which has, depending on who you ask, between 18 and 22 million people. So about 22 times bigger than Columbus, but geographically not much bigger. And many of those people lived at sea level. I also got a chance to travel inland and saw some villages there where their water table is getting drawn down quite rapidly. That's causing problems for them having enough drinking water and also enough water for farming and irrigation. And then I live on the east side of Columbus, so I need to update this photo. I now have 3 children. I have a 4-month-old at home, and so we try to make sure we practice a lot of what we preach, and a lot of what I share today is things that have changed how we operate as a family and things we do or avoid doing. So I like to start out with this. A few things to reflect on. Vatican has installed solar panels, procured electric vehicles, and established a forest preserve to become the world's first carbon neutral state. Emissions from Catholic churches, schools, and other operations are comparable to a medium-sized country such as Chile. If it were a country, the Catholic Church would be one of the 50 largest emitters in the world. And last, there's 1.1 billion Catholics in the world. The total world population is a little over 7 billion. So 1 in 7 people approximately. So the reason I share this is if there's a pretty wide reach of the Catholic community, if the Catholic community facilities wise and individual wise decided to do something about climate change and reduce emissions, there's a lot of potential for change. And I think that first statement you see here is the Vatican's already done quite a bit. But now it's a matter of scaling that around the world and around the US. And some of that is happening locally, but I want to frame the conversation with this to start with. You have a lot of control to make decisions that will have a dramatic effect over the next 30 and 40 years and the future you see. And it's important to know individually and collectively what power you have as a group in order to have that change. And when we close out today, we'll revisit this and talk about things you can immediately do. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is if you have a piece of paper and pencil in front of you, I'd like you to take that out right now. I mentioned the Pope 5 years ago had an encyclical or a letter he ended up writing. We knew this was coming for 4 or 5 years. A lot of us were really interested in seeing this. It got released early to Google with a Google Translate. So there was a hacked version that came out. And I immediately read that hacked version a week before it came out. And I've since read it 3 times. I typically do not read a lot of Vatican documents, but this was a very different letter. And it was more far reaching than we thought it was going to be. So I'd like you to take a second and look at this quote. And then I'd like you to reflect, the history of our friendship with God is always linked to a particular place, which takes on intensely personal meaning. We all remember places and revisit those memories. Memories does us much good. Anyone who's grown up in the hills or used to sit by the spring to drink or played outdoors in the neighborhood square, going back to these places is a chance to recover something of their true selves. So I'd like you to take a second, reflect on that quote, select a place that is special to you and write down what that place is. And then why in the world in a sentence is that, how do you feel when you're there? What does that place make you feel and why is it special to you? So we'll take about a minute and a half and do that and then we'll reconvene. Okay, so if you have that, I invite everybody to take a second. Don't put this in the chat yet. Type it in the chat, but don't hit enter. I'd like you to take that place and capture it in a word or two. Just type what it is, and then a phrase describing the why. But we're going to hit enter at the same time. So just don't hit enter yet. I'm going to give a little countdown, and we're going to see them all kind of explode onto the screen at the same time. Yeah, so once again, type in the place and the why in a phrase, but don't hit enter yet.
I meant to put enter
That's
as
okay. That's
like
okay,
a
Grady.
to go to the next line.
Yeah, I'm gonna have everybody hit enter at exactly the same time. So we
That's
all
okay,
see
Grady.
everybody. It's okay if you've done it, it's fine. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Remember, it doesn't have to be a paper, it's just a phrase. Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1, hit enter. Okay, take a second. Feel free to scroll through some of those.
This is great.
Okay, thanks for sharing, everybody. So in this, I think the encyclical, one of the things that was maybe surprising is Pope Francis's writing is very visual, and there's a lot of compelling language, things that appeals to not just science or facts, but emotions and feelings you have, places that are special to you, and trying to capture what that connection is. I think it was interesting. A lot of people here put stuff that is connected to the outdoors in some way, and I don't think that's by accident. I think we have a natural connection to the outdoors. To give you a sense of what this encyclical is, I could tell you about it. I'm not going to do as good a job, so I'm going to stop the screen share for a second because Catholic Relief Services out of the UK did a great job of a few years ago actually making a video with this that gives you as an infographic a very fast overview. This is the fastest, best overview I've ever seen anybody do. So let's optimize this and start it up, and we're going to take a second and look at this before we move on. I'll maximize here in just a second.
Pope Francis has written a letter addressed to every person on this planet, urging us all to protect the Earth, our common home. In the letter, he says, "The Earth is God's gift to us, full of beauty and wonder, where the fruits of the earth belong to everyone. But what we see today is that our common home has never been so hurt and mistreated as it has been in the last 200 years. We have developed at a greater speed than we could ever have imagined. We have treated the Earth like it has an unlimited supply of resources, taking more than our fair share from most people on the planet, as well as future generations to come. We have stripped the Earth of its natural forests, contaminated the Earth's waters, its land, and its air. Plants and species are becoming extinct at an alarming rate. The Earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Our increasing use of polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, oil, and gas, is helping to drive climate change, which is one of the biggest challenges we face today. Climate change affects us all, but it is the poorest communities who suffer the most. We are now at crisis point, where the future of our common home is under threat. And despite this crisis, there seems to be no slowdown in the lifestyles of the rich nations. Enormous gaps between the rich and the poor continue to rise. Between those who are trapped in poverty with few or no resources, and those who are consuming and wasting at an ever-increasing rate, leaving a trail of waste and destruction. Our digital world is also polluting us with noise and distractions, stopping us from learning how to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. Real relationships are replaced with virtual friendships, which we can choose to accept or reject, making us dissatisfied with true, deep relationships, or can give rise to a new sense of isolation. Yet, despite all of this, all is not lost. Young people demand change. Young people want to build a better future, which takes seriously the environmental crisis and the sufferings of the poor. So we can change. We can make a new start. To protect our common home, we need a common plan. The whole human family needs to work together so that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Our use of polluting fossil fuels also needs to be replaced without delay. And we need to stop treating the world's resources as an object for profit, with no thought on how our actions might affect the environment or future generations. So let's put love for the world and love for our neighbour into action by living together in harmony, listening to one another, caring for nature, and getting involved with society and politics. Let's undergo an eco-conversion in which we listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. This means taking seriously things like avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water waste, separating rubbish, and using public transport as a part of our calling to protect creation. But more urgently, we need to slow down on how much we consume and throw away. We can find great joy and freedom in living simply, rather than always on the lookout for what we do not have. We are capable of these changes and making a new start. So let us make that start today. Signed, Pope Francis. Laudato Si, a letter from Pope Francis on care for our common home.
Okay, so that is the entire letter in 5 minutes. Okay, let me switch over. Screen share real quick again. So what I'd like you to do is take a second in the chat, and I'd like to hear from people anything in that you found particularly surprising. Because I think there's some parts of that maybe I know when I read it, there's a lot that was in there that I didn't expect to find in this letter that I was told was really a letter of climate change. So we could take a second and have people drop into there, things that maybe jumped out at you as surprising. And I will also say a lot of what's in there, the language are actually direct quotes from Laudato Si. So this is nothing that an animator took liberties to create. A lot of that language is directly from the English translation. Any surprises? Okay, thanks, Matt, and thank you, T. Thanks, Melissa. Ben, Emmy. So this letter was anticipated for years, and it was really, many of us had heard it was going to be an encyclical focus on climate change. And I think when you started reading it, it became immediately obvious that was not the case. You saw that this is actually a much bigger letter. Thank you, Mario. And so it did focus on big picture environmental issues, but the other parts that were there were, I think when you reflect back on it, make complete sense, but it was more inclusive. It talked about young people. It talked about the future generations that will live with the problem. It focused on people. And I think in the US, we are quite, we often separate people from the environment, but we are connected to it closely. We might have built a lot of the environment around us, but we've seen with some of the weather the last few weeks, we are not far removed from what goes on around us. My brother lives in Texas and he saw this firsthand. You can't separate us from it. We are part of it. And so if you're going to deal with environmental challenges, you need to think about the people that are affected and both causing the problems and that will suffer the repercussions of what you do. And focusing on relationships is part of that. And the other part that I think made a lot of people in the US very uncomfortable was those of us that have the most are actually causing most of the problem, but have the resources to protect ourselves from it. So we've worked with individuals in Tanzania, it's in Africa, and one of the challenges somebody said is, well, what could they do to reduce their greenhouse emissions? And I said, you know, it's kind of hard to ask them because they emit so little versus I can do more than many of them can every day by just not driving my car. And I am causing much more of the problem, but I also have the resources that I can put drains in my yard and I can buy an air conditioning system. That's a luxury people in that country don't have. And so it made people in the US very uncomfortable. And I still think we are facing that discomfort. And I would challenge you to think about one of the things that challenges me in my faith community and why I work with the diocese is this is a topic we don't really hear about in church very often. But it is a document that's a very official, and the Vatican has been very vocal with, and came out 5.5 years ago. So I know for me that tries to make me work harder to share it with others. And I see Kevin and David also posted some stuff in the chat. Thanks, guys. Okay, so originally we were gonna do this as a breakout room, but before you can look forward, it's always good to think about where we are today. I worked with the diocese a few years ago and we made a whole plan for things that the individuals, parishes, schools, hospitals, there's a number of hospitals in the region that are connected to the Catholic Church, can do to be more environmentally friendly. So what I'd like to do is I broke this down by grade levels. This would be something you're just going to do individually with the paper in front of you. But for 6th grade, I've given you 2 topics on the screen. 7th grade, I've given you 1 topic. And 8th grade, I've given you 2. I'd like you to look through this list and identify 2 things that you feel you individually or your church are doing well or have already done. You've accomplished it. And I'd like you to decide on 2 you think you could work towards the next step on. Okay. So just read through the list individually, identify 2 things that you're doing really well or you finished, you've done already, and 2 things you could immediately go out and start doing tomorrow that would be the next step. And then we're going to share those out in just a moment. We'll have everybody use audio to share these by grade level in just a second. And if you're wondering about the I's and the P's and the H's, P's stood for parish, a parish focus, H stood for home, and I stood for kind of individual. That was the breakdown on it. Did this get sent out ahead of time? No, I wasn't sure. This
It did not, no.
Okay. Well, we might have to skip over that then. There was a copy that was going to be sent out about this ahead of time. Okay, let's take a break for a second and do this then. So sixth grade, it's energy conservation and efficiency and water conservation. Seventh grade is buying and sharing food. Eighth grade is recycling and transportation. So let's do this. Let's just, if you can't see the screen, that's fine. Give me something you are doing well in those areas and something you could work on in those areas. Even if you can't see the screen, those are the topics. So sixth grade is energy efficiency and water conservation. Seventh grade is buying and sharing food. Eighth grade is purchasing and recycling, and also transportation. We'll just do one thing you're doing well and one thing you could work on. Okay, so anyone at the sixth grade level, something with energy efficiency or water conservation that's being done really well right now in your home or your parish. Or something that could be worked on. Maybe there's nothing you can find. So maybe it's, what's the next step you can go do?
I'll throw something out there, Jason. So I try to keep our house here fairly moderate in terms of heat in the winter, AC in the summer. Now, can't say that my wife always agrees. The house is a little cool sometimes in the winter, but but we try to conserve energy as best we can in the house.
Okay. So some decisions that you've made to adjust the temperature, maybe dress appropriately or dress for the weather. Thermostats help there. Yeah, Kevin, it's okay. You can just think of those topics and grab something from the list. Just grab something from something you know about or something you could do. I know in our house, we kind of did two of these at the same time. We put a really efficient hot water tank in, which means we don't run the water as much to get it hot, but also it saves us burning fuel and it saves us money on our gas bill. So we actually did two of these at the same time. If anybody has, you can actually do energy audits in the state of Ohio. You can replace some things on your faucets to make the water, you get the same effect, but less of it flows out because water is becoming more and more expensive in places like Ohio. Okay, what about seventh grade? Buying, sharing food. Anybody from seventh grade think of something that goes in the buying or sharing food category?
Yeah, one thing we do is we definitely take advantage of opportunities to buy locally, organic food, shop locally when we can, go to local farms, things of that nature to sort of support the local food supply.
Thank you. Anybody's fasting for Lent? We have kind of fish on Friday or meatless Friday. Some people also start doing that on a Monday. Being a vegetarian or lower on the food chain can have one of the biggest effects on the environment as far as the amount of land you need. Some people do this as a choice to reflect on the fact that we have a lot of food and very affluent food with meat, versus some people will do like a beans and rice one day a week. Kind of reminds them of the fact that this is unusual, the amount of food we have access to in this country. Eating leftovers and don't throw it away. You've even seen like little free pantries show up to try to do that. Not only providing food for more people, but also wasting less and less ends up in the landfill. If anybody's had a parish event, if you can take some of that food and make sure that there's nothing wasted that gets taken to a shelter. I know we've done that a lot on the east side with Christ the King. If there's a big event, somebody's always making sure they're taking it down there. Okay, eighth grade, go ahead.
I would say one more thing we do. I think some of the townships around here have started programs around composting. So if you do have, waste, if you're peeling carrots and banana peels and all that stuff, composting I think is a great solution.
Yeah, it's easier than ever. Curbside, or you can do it in your backyard. You can buy a composter for very little money. Okay, 8th grade, purchasing, recycling and transportation, stuff you can do or stuff you do successfully or things you could do better.
I think as a family, we recycle pretty well.
So curbside's easier than ever, making sure you're doing that. Thank you. Sophia said carpooling and that helps reduce fuel emissions. Yeah, making sure you travel together or use as few trips as possible. Recycling cardboard boxes. So getting them in the recycling bin or reusing them. We have a friend who happens to have a little Amazon business, and we collect all our boxes in the basement and once a month run them all over. So those boxes get a second, third, or fourth life as they're going out. Cycling a lot, yes. Part of the reason we bought our house where we did is we can bike almost anywhere around the city from here. Okay, well, thank you for sharing. So there's some stuff you might be doing successfully. This whole document has a list of things you can do to kind of stretch yourself. Okay, so that kind of finishes the second portion. I want to take about 10 minutes here and go over some of the science, because that's the other hat I wear, some of what's happening right now and how basic it is, and then some of the impacts your generation will be facing. That's going to be even more pronounced what I faced and even more than what my parents faced. So this is the greenhouse effect. People I work with, we spend a lot of time studying this. Infrared light or visible light comes in from the sun and strikes Earth, gets re-emitted back as infrared light. This is what it would look like if we had no atmosphere. We have an atmosphere, and the atmosphere has greenhouse gases like water vapor, CO2, methane. And so those gases actually absorb and re-emit that infrared light a few times. And that's what keeps some of the heat in the planet and allows it to stay warm. If we didn't have these greenhouse gases, those of you that are Star Wars fans that like The Empire Strikes Back, Earth would look like Hoth. So that's what a place would look like without greenhouse gases. It'd be very cold and very icy. It would look like Ohio looked like during our last ice age, where we had a half mile of ice above us. So for life on Earth and life as we know it, these greenhouse gases are good. But if you add too many of them, which is what we've done over the last 200 years, that energy, that infrared light gets trapped a little bit longer. And that's what's causing the temperature to go up. Now, as Matt mentioned, taking the thermostat and turning it up or down a degree, my wife notices this when I turn the thermostat down a degree, right? We can feel this subtle difference. And so can our pocketbook when you pay your bill. Changing the temperature of the Earth a degree or two might not seem like a big deal, but there's a lot of material on Earth. And if you warm that all up a degree or 2 or 3, or right now we're shooting for 4.5, that's a lot of additional energy, and that causes some dramatic changes. In fact, Ohio, when we had a half mile of ice above us in Columbus 10,000 years ago, was only about 7 degrees cooler. And that's what caused that much ice to be located here. So you don't need to change the Earth's temperature a lot to get a big difference in impact. I also want to point out, this is not cutting edge science. The people I work with, we are looking at the details of how the jet stream is changing and how fast ice is melting, how quickly sea level rise will go up, what this means for farmers in the state and putting pipes in the ground to divert the water. But if you look on here, this is not new science. This is going back to France in the mid 1700s. And these are all some of the big players that have helped us understand the greenhouse effect and what's happening. But it's not cutting edge stuff. We're beyond there. And we've really had a good understanding of this for the last 40 years. So if you're watching the news and they're saying, well, we're not really sure about climate change, or this is a new thing, it's not really settled yet. It was settled 4 decades ago, well before you were born. It's a matter now of the impact and how quickly it's happening and how we can adjust. But I want to give you some historical perspective. This is what the graph looks like since 1960. This is since we've been measuring CO2 with sensors all over the planet. You notice there's 2 patterns here. This is the most famous graph in the building where I work. You see 2 patterns. One is a seesaw and one is this upward trend. The seesaw is the breathing of the planet. And you might not think about it, but most of the Earth's land is in the northern hemisphere. So every year in the spring and summer, when leaves come out, they suck the entire planet's CO2 down. And that means the CO2 drops. And then in the fall, winter, and spring, those leaves rot and they release it back to the atmosphere. And that causes that seesaw pattern. That's the planet breathing. The upward trend is humanity. Since about 200 years ago, when we started mining coal, pulling out natural gas and oil, we've essentially reversed a process in nature that took tens of millions of years to grab all that CO2 and trap it underground. and we are releasing it in just a few hundred years. So this has become one of the most dramatic changes in the entire planet's history, as we pump that CO2 back out. Now I can give you, since I work with ice core researchers, I can give you more data. This is just since we have had sensors sitting around. If I go out a little farther, this is what it looks like if I go back to emissions the beginning, when we first started to burn fossil fuels. And I can go take it even farther. This goes about 10,000 years. This is when the last ice age happened on Earth. And I can take it even farther. This goes about 800,000 years. This is the oldest ice core ever recovered from Antarctica. And if you notice something, you notice there's this up and down, up and down, up and down pattern, but it really never goes over 300 parts per million until after the 1960s. And then it shoots up. And it shoots up to about 420 is where we are right now. We are probably shooting for, if we keep on our trajectory, between 7, 8, 9, 1,000 parts per million CO2. We have never seen this amount of CO2 on Earth in the last 3 million years. We've never seen this amount of CO2 when we had massive cities located at the coast, and we've had a lifestyle with farming that we have today. So we are approaching a place that we don't have any analog, any comparison, since people have been, as we are today, living in communities, working together. And so that's why this is a big challenge. And the oceans will be different, our temperatures will be different. We've already seen our rains become very different in Ohio, but this is the thing that's causing it. So that's the historical perspective. Impacts you are likely to see. And I'm going to fly through these real quick just so you see what's coming. Sea level rise. This is Florida and Louisiana today. This is with approximately 3 yard or about a 9-foot sea level rise. Those parts of the state disappear. So we'll flash back. This is from Dan Schrag at Harvard. Actually, sorry, that is a 4-foot sea level rise. So it's even less than that, but there's a significant portions of the country that disappear under oceans. Now to look at places that are flooding and what that looks like in other parts of the country, New York, 7% is in the flood zone. Houston, where my brother lives, 26%. Tampa Bay, 31%. Miami-Dade County is 54%. New Orleans, 100% of the communities in the 500-year floodplain. So these are places that are facing flooding due to sea level rise. And these are only the places at the coast. There was an update that came out last week, and we are starting to look at flooding conditions for places like Ohio and how flood insurance is going to go up as a consequence of that. Temperatures, this is what the planets looked like since 1880s when we first built thermometers. And you'll notice blue areas are places that are cooler than average in a 5-year window. Orange areas are places that are warmer than average. You notice every year some places are warmer, some places are cooler. It fluctuates. But you'll happen to see a shift happen in the 1970s. We have a lot fewer cold conditions and a lot more really hot conditions. And you'll especially notice this in 2 parts of the planet. In fact, we break 3 record high temperatures for every record low we now have. The warmest places you're seeing are the Arctic, where there's a lot of communities that are already facing a 4-degree temperature increase. And this is because all that sea ice and snow is melting, and what's left is very dark surfaces, ocean water and dirt and dark green surfaces that absorb more of that sunlight and cause more warming. Now, for those of us living in Ohio, you might say, well, it doesn't seem like it's hit home in Ohio too much. Columbus has the distinction of one of the fastest urban heat island growths in the country. So these are days that it is warmer in the city than it is in the rural areas. And I have seen this. I used to commute out every day. And there are some days in Columbus, downtown where I live, there are actually 2 miles from where I live, where the highest buildings are. It is 24 degrees warmer than if you got in the car and you drove out to the farm fields out in Licking County. That's how much warmer it is. We saw a bit of that last summer, but heat is still the #1 killer for people in this country. You might think hurricanes, people die of flooding or die of winds. It's generally not. It's oftentimes people that die because the AC went out at the senior citizen center and there was no backup generator. And 2 years ago in Florida, that's what we saw. It was heat is the #1 killer. If we go back to Chicago in '95, a massive event, there was between 800 and 1,200 people that passed away in a weekend because the temperatures were so high for so long, and people had no air conditioning or felt unsafe to open their windows because of the neighborhood they left in, because they were isolated. Many of them older and many of them poor, and they had no social safety net. Precip. We're getting more heavy rains. We saw this last spring. I don't know if anybody had your basement flood or if you had your street flood. We've had cars washed out. We've had a number of interstates in Ohio that never flooded in the last few years. This was just a few years ago in 2014 between here and Dayton, a roadway that never flooded. It had 5 feet of water and a 1,000-year flood event, but we're seeing these events happen more and more common. And it's causing a lot of damage. And the other thing it does is it's not just infrastructure like roads, it's submerged cars, flooded basements, or farm fields that the nutrients and fertilizer wash off into rivers. Now, this looks kind of disgusting. You have some algae growth. Yeah, this would be a problem if you decide to drink it or decide to paddle in it. But it also shuts down water treatment facilities. Like my parents in Toledo, where over a weekend, they actually could not drink any of their tap water because the water was contaminated. And they could not filter the pollutant that the algae was making to make it safe for drinking. This has become a big issue in Ohio and a big issue for farmers because they don't want to have their fertilizer end up in the water. But if it rains really hard after they fertilize, it could. And so it's causing a problem because they'll lose money, but it also means we have no drinking water. And so this is the summary. This is what things look like in Ohio. By the end of your life, we can expect our winters to look much more like North Carolina's. In fact, this graphic's a little out of date because we are burning more than we thought we would. So it's definitely gonna look like North Carolina. Our summers will not, this looks like Missouri on here, Missouri and Arkansas. We're gonna look more like northern Texas. That's what our summer conditions will look like. So if you think of that hot, humid conditions you see in northern Texas, that's what Ohio's future looks like. And things will have to change. You know, how much we air condition, even the crops we grow. And things like the Buckeye tree, this just makes my phone ring off the hook. On campus, they don't even plant true Buckeye trees anymore. They plant something called a horse chestnut that looks like a Buckeye. It's not a true Buckeye plant because we expect in the future Buckeye trees might only be able to grow in places like Michigan, which is ironic. Number one reason youth, people your age, go to the ER in Central Ohio, respiratory issues. This will be made worse by climate change. If you enjoy snorkeling or scuba diving, ecosystems, the temperatures are affecting the oceans, but also the acidity of CO2. And last but not least, something that many people think has nothing to do with climate change is humanitarian relief. And we've had members from the military in our building trying to make sure that everybody is aware the military's number one thing they respond to is humanitarian crises. People think about bombs and guns and planes and stuff like that, but oftentimes they're the first one delivering food relief or evacuating people, even in other countries. And places like the Syrian refugee crisis, what caused that is there's a millennium drought happening in Syria right now. And when people couldn't feed their families, what they did is they left to go to the city to get a job. They couldn't find work. There was already political instability in Syria, and this made it worse. If you look in South America today, South America is facing a similar issue where they've had crop failures due to climate change. And those migrants are moving north to the US border. And this is causing tension in the US itself as people try to grapple with, do we want to allow additional people to move into the country or not? But these both events are climate change connected, which does connect to the US because we are the number one emitter per person of CO2. And that's causing those events to happen. So these places might seem far, but they're very connected to what happens to us every day. Okay, so what I want to do is pause for a second and see if there's any questions that want to come in, because then we're going to talk about what you can immediately go out and do today and why this is really something that your generation has control over and needs to demand action on and be involved in getting that action going. That was the gloom and doom part of my talk. We get more hopeful from here. Okay, well, Matt and Jay, if anything comes in, go ahead and make sure you interrupt me here. So here's the uplifting part. There's a heck of a lot people your age can do. If you look at Greta Thunberg, who's the young woman from Scandinavia, who's really was behind the climate strikes and has been able to articulate the needs of a future generation. to people in power. I think you see an example of how that can work. Her simple actions that were not designed to draw attention to herself has got worldwide attention. And it's helped people listen. And her voice and her writings have also helped clarify why this is important for your generation more than it is mine and that of my parents. I want to show you some statistics, though, that also help us with this. There's surveys done throughout the US every year. And if you ask Ohioans, this was done in 2020, it's done every year, how many of them think that climate change will harm future generations? 71% in Ohio think it will harm future generations. It's already causing harm. Many of them, ironically, think it won't harm them, but they are confident it will harm future generations. So there's kind of acknowledgement this is can be harmful for your generation. Next question. How many individuals that you survey would say research in renewable energy sources is a good thing, right? 86%. There's widespread support for this across the state, across all counties, across all political backgrounds. You see this. So there's widespread acknowledgement and support for investing in renewable energy. So this is a good thing. People would be happy to move over to this if it was available, and it actually is today. I think this is the counterbalance to that, though. Number of adults who discuss global warming at least occasionally, and it plummets to nothing. And so what's interesting is most Ohioans are actually on board to doing something. Most acknowledge it will be harmful. Most acknowledge we have the tools to do something about it, yet nobody talks about it. And in fact, everybody's afraid to talk about it because they think the other person across the table likely will be dismissive or confrontational. And in fact, that is not the case. That's only about 1 out of 10 Ohioans. So you actually have an open space to discuss this and at least say, I'd like to talk about it. I'd like to talk about why we aren't doing anything or what we could do. And your generation is probably better poised to do that than any other. And I show you this because the will is there, but people are afraid to even talk about it. And if you're not going to talk about it, it's very difficult to talk about solutions or getting them passed. So you need to have the space to realize most people are on board. They just need the dialogue to get it going. And you might be the person to help that along. Now, there are those people in our lives, and I have these as well in my family. This is a really hard conversation, and we've been trying to chip away at it for a few years, and we are making some progress. It's not always easy, though. And maybe those aren't the people you want to start with. It's the person who it's a little easier to begin the conversation with. So things you can do when you start that conversation. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've got to burn fewer fossil fuels. Okay, so you need to make sure you get information from credible sources. Facebook often is not that source. And if you're looking at stuff, make sure you know it's from a credible source. I can build a really nice website for $30 with an hour of time, and I can say anything I want. And that doesn't mean I'm credible in what I'm saying. If you don't believe that, there's a wonderful website called the Society to Ban Dihydrogen Monoxide. I would definitely go check that site out. And if any of you are taking chemistry or mention this, you can think about what dihydrogen monoxide is, and we can talk about that at the end. But there's a whole website dedicated to banning this substance. Know who you're voting for office. Many of you will be allowed to vote soon on ballot initiatives and individuals. Know what somebody's stand is. It's easy to find on their website, and there's a lot of places that provide this information. Look at voting records. Grassroots things. You can go to city council meetings. You can go to school board meetings. You can go to parish council meetings. You can write a letter to the editor. Many people in leadership positions take track of all that. And if a bunch of young people show up and ask questions or demand things, and they do that consistently, they're more likely to get their elected officials or people in power to listen, especially if it's giving a reason and it's giving a what this solution is they'd like to see done. Make sure you realize every day, besides you make decisions besides just voting, when you spend your dollars. And when I was a friend of mine and I, a group of us, we cycle a lot. We were able to get a local restaurant to put out bike parking in front of their place because they like to see 20 of us show up after cycling to eat a meal. And it was easy to get them to put that bike parking because they wanted that done. So even if a company you'd like to buy something from isn't doing practices that you're in agreement with, hey, ask them to change the way they operate. And we've seen a lot of major companies in the US go carbon neutral because the people buying stuff from them demand it. Others do it for financial reasons. Walmart has a lot of renewable energy because it saves them a lot of money. And even the semis coming back from Walmart distribution, they don't come back empty. They come back full with recycled boxes because they don't want to waste the fuel. So it's especially easy if the dollars and cents match the moral reason to do it. Build sustainability into what you're doing at work and at Christ the King, we've done a lot to make our building more energy efficient. We were able to cut our energy usage a lot with our light bulbs because they had these massive old 1960s light bulbs, and we were able to cut the energy use in the actual sanctuary to about 15% of what it used to be for lighting. So that saves a lot of money for other things that could be done. It also means nobody has to get a scaffold out or a lift once or twice a year to change the light bulbs, which is A, dangerous, and B, expensive. And then last but not least, what I said before, start a conversation with people. That's one of the most important things to do at this point. So what I'll do is I'll kind of close for Q&A. These are some of the things my family's done. We did put a bunch of rain gardens around our house. We've done a bunch of ripping out of landscaping to make sure it's stuff that's grown in Ohio. A lot of food plants where we can. We did a bunch of energy efficiency because we have a really, really old house. It was built in 1908. After we did all that energy efficiency work, we did install solar panels on the house. But we also provide any of the energy we buy for our house comes from wind energy. You can do that in Ohio today. You don't have to put solar panels on. You can get all of your wind energy from all your electricity from wind energy today by just changing how you sign up. And then we tend to cycle around a lot. We've got some crazy bike contraptions we use because in the summer, that's our #1 way of getting around. So for the kind of the closing discussion here, there's 2 quotes I wanted to put up here that summarize, I think, everything I've talked about today and why this matters. It isn't just the environment, it's the people it connects to, and people that are more vulnerable than us that have contributed less to this problem and will deal more with it, and your generation. So we don't ask politicians oftentimes and leaders to make decisions that are going to see a benefit 30 years from now, but your generation now has this imperative to ask for that you are somebody that want to make sure when you have children in the future and you are retiring, that Ohio will be as beautiful as it is today, and those same opportunities you have, your family will have. So with that, I will close out, and I'll leave this up here for a second, then I'll flip to a whole list, checkerboard of stuff people can go out and do today.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And at this point, we'll open it up to any questions. You could either shout out the questions or send them through the chat. I guess as people are thinking about that, just a question myself. And we have 6th, 7th, 8th graders online here, middle school. So at what point, Jason, in your life, did you think that this was going to be your life's passion, climate, weather, environment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mentioned in the chat earlier, I spent a lot of time outdoors because my mom's from Northern Ontario as a child. My grandparents had a cottage. And I think doing that, spending time with families, being outside, it was problem solving. That was a really fun memory. So I think in some ways my work always connected to ecology and the outdoors. I made a pretty dramatic career change when I got back from India because the impact of working in India, I had a harder time coming back to the US than I had going to India. I had a really hard time coming home because what I saw there was a lot of people dealing with adversity and really challenging conditions and doing a good job with it. And I had a hard time coming home because I felt like people were complaining about trivial stuff. Like I saw kids that were biking miles to school every day because they had no choice in really miserable conditions. Teaching, I taught in a school that was 100 degrees during the day with no air conditioning. So you could, it was just, you felt like you ran a marathon at the end of the day. And so when I came back, I had a hard time returning home. And so when I changed jobs, I think it was partly driven by that. But I don't think I appreciated how much my phone would ring off the hook in the next few years with questions of climate change. That's not why I took the job, but that is the #1 question I get. And it's everything from people trying to figure out basements flooding to how their community responds. The other part, though, is troubling for me is I remember going to a colleague at Ohio State's office and sitting down and saying, how frustrated I was that the Catholic Church wasn't doing anything about climate change, right? This seemed to be very consistent with social teaching. And he paused and he's like, time out. He's also Catholic. And he said, no, they actually have some really forceful documents. They had forceful documents that came out in 2000 and 2001. And I said, but why haven't I heard about these? And he's like, that's a great question. He said, but here's what they are. And so I think a number of us started trying to make sure that more people were aware of them. Like, this is consistent with your faith. It is troubling to me that your faith community isn't talking about it. It's the Vatican's talking about it. I think in the US, we are talking about it less than any other country right now. And it could be because I think In some ways, it makes us uncomfortable. In some ways, we realize we have a lot of change that has to happen with this. But I think that dialogue has to become more open if we're going to acknowledge we have a problem and do something about it. So that's the uncomfortable part of why I do the work and why a lot of us volunteer, because we want to make sure there's a good world for our children and they get the same opportunities we did.
Jason, just one other question. Are there any lessons learned from a policy standpoint from the last year that just sort of shows the motivation that what motivation can do in terms of changing behaviors, how quickly the world changed behaviors based on the pandemic? Are there lessons learned for how that can apply to climate change?
I think so. I think the good thing that's been, we've seen a lot of people doing individual actions and trying to be creative about taking stuff and scaling it. The thing is, we need to get more people to do that faster. And we need to make sure the incentives are right so that if we make these changes, the poorest among us that are already vulnerable aren't stuck with a bill they can't pay. And I think that's been, I think the issues of how we talk to one another and issues with justice with racial groups in the US and access to class issues are all coming to a head because this overlaps with that, right? If you're poor, you're likely to buy housing. You have to take housing in a floodplain because it's cheaper. It's energy inefficient. Well, that's going to cost you more. And so I think I am heartened by the fact more people are having those conversations about how these things intersect and how we do better as a group. And there's been a lot of innovation. The other thing is all the tools are out there. Like we could go do this today if we had the will. You could take all your light bulbs in your house and replace them with LEDs today and never replace another light bulb in your life and save energy every day after you twist that light bulb in. And yet I'm still working with the city of Columbus to do that with our fixtures, our light fixtures. Like we haven't done it. I did it in my house a decade ago. It wasn't any more expensive then. And yet we got to get those things done faster. We can't wait anymore. And I tell people too, like, this doesn't have to be a confrontational issue. I did have a talk I gave to a group a few weeks ago, and the talk, it was to a Catholic group, and they started out with asking me to justify that this was consistent with our faith. And I was just shocked that in 2021, I had to justify that this work was consistent with the faith tradition. But I don't get that from young people. How long would it take? Celio mentioned how long would it take to reverse the effects of climate change? The scary part is it's not really reversible. It would take thousands of years to reverse it for nature to pull that CO2 back out. So effectively it isn't. You have to stop the genie from getting out of the bottle. You need to stop the CO2 from being emitted, because once it is, there's no technology we have to pull it out. Now you'll hear companies saying, well, we've got technology that we think can do this. There's nothing that's scalable right now. So your best bet is just not to let it happen in the first place. That's the easiest, least expensive, surefire way of making sure you're not faced with a problem. I live in the east side of Columbus. I can tell you that I have a bunch of places around my house that are brownfields. They were environmental pollutant sites, and they're still fixing them. We can fix those kind of things. You can take topsoil out, you can strip lead paint. You can't put CO2 back underground easily.
Well, I think we're coming up on our time here. So on behalf of our parish, Jason, we just wanted to thank you for your time today and all the information you've shared. Keep up the great work. I'd like to end with, if you don't mind, we were emailing back and forth this week, Jason. I noticed the tagline on your email was quite interesting. Just wanted to share that. It reads, "We have not inherited the earth from our ancestors. We have only borrowed it from our children." So definitely a thought to keep in mind. Jason, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. And anybody here that does want to change their energy to renewable, there's a thing called Energy Choice Ohio here. You can go online today and you can buy wind energy from your house. So I would encourage you, if you want to go have an effect today, sign up for that. You'll find it's not any more expensive, but you can actually change the sourcing for your house. Thanks for everybody's time today.
Great. Thank you all. Have a blessed
Thank you.
Sunday. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.